Some truths don't shout, they wait. Harrison Ford hadn't set foot on a late-night stage in years, but when he finally did, it wasn't for laughs. It was for something quieter and heavier. A message he'd carried through storms, through scripts, through silence. And when Jimmy Kimmel handed him a whip and a joke, Ford didn't flinch. He answered with the one thing that couldn't be edited: honesty. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story hits home, be sure to subscribe. Harrison Ford walks onto the stage of Jimmy Kimmel Live like a man stepping through a curtain of noise and neon, not into a talk show, but into a storm he already knows the shape of. The crowd erupts, cheers, whistles, a few standing ovations from the back rows. Studio lights flare, camera dollies glide like predators, and the house band punches out a riff that sounds almost heroic. It's not applause. It's expectation wearing cologne. Jimmy Kimmel grins wide, arms open as if welcoming a king, though the gesture feels more rehearsed than reverent. "And here he is," Jimmy says, pacing toward the desk. "The man who doesn't need a whip because just showing up makes the crowd surrender, Harrison Ford." The screen behind them flashes, quick cuts, bright overlays, a TikTok-style montage of Indiana Jones ducking boulders, piloting planes, kissing women, punching Nazis. Music chopped and warped for short-form dopamine. The crowd eats it up. One guy in the third row is already filming with his phone. Ford stops center stage. He's 82 but still stands like someone who built his back with lumber and storms. He looks at the crowd, not smiling, not waving. His hands rest at his sides, fingers curled slightly inward as if gripping something invisible. The applause starts to fade, not because it's over, but because no one's sure if he's going to do anything. Jimmy moves fast, sensing the lull. "Come on, that's gotta bring back memories," he says, motioning toward the screen. "That boulder scene, still iconic. You outran a rock before most of us learned to walk." Ford turns, slow and silent, eyes grazing the tick-tock reel still flickering behind him. Then he looks past Jimmy, beyond the band, into the rigging above the audience. His expression doesn't shift. He's not confused. He's choosing stillness. The crowd laughs anyway, unsure of what they're laughing at. Maybe just the tension. Maybe habit. Jimmy chuckles too, a bit too loud. "I swear, we tried to find the clip where you smile, but we ran out of tape." Ford's jaw tightens. It's a small thing. Blink and you'd miss it. But the cameraman doesn't miss it. He zooms in. The control room watches the monitor like a sniper watches wind. Ford finally moves, just one step forward, no line yet, no smile. The band stops on cue, but something in the air doesn't land right. The cheers didn't turn into silence. They slid into unease. He sits, one hand on the armrest, one on his thigh, eyes locked not on Jimmy but on the lights overhead, like he's measuring something. In that moment, he doesn't look like an actor. He looks like a craftsman who just walked into a room built crooked. The cameras are rolling, the crowd's still buzzing, Jimmy's still grinning. But Harrison Ford hasn't said a word, and somehow that says everything. Backstage, the control room buzzed with the low thrum of producers speaking in clipped tones, headsets hissing, camera angles shifting like chess pieces. Lucas stood in the shadows, arms crossed, headset off, eyes locked on the monitor. He wasn't smiling. He never did during live tapings, not when Harrison was involved. "Don't push him," he'd told the director 5 minutes ago. "He's not here to sell a meme. Don't turn this into some reaction circus." The director had nodded, too fast, too distracted. "We've got it covered." But Lucas saw the glint in his eye, the kind that comes with a viral forecast and the thirst for digital fireworks. Back on stage, Jimmy Kimmel was settling into the monologue part of his routine, the part where he pretends it's all casual, all fun, just two guys shooting the breeze. He leaned back in his chair and hit a button under the desk. The screen behind him flickered again, this time to a grainy photo of Harrison Ford in a hoodie and cargo pants, pushing a shopping cart in a grocery store parking lot. A half-eaten banana in one hand, face expressionless, as if daring the paparazzi to make it interesting. The crowd howled. Someone in the front row let out a sharp whistle. Another voice, female, called out, "Legend." And laughter spiked like a needle. Jimmy grinned, proud of the setup. "Look at that," Jimmy said, pointing up at the image. "I mean, if grumpy grocery runs were an Olympic sport, we know who's bringing home gold." Ford's mouth curled. Just a little, enough to be mistaken for amusement, but the grin didn't reach his eyes. "It's funny, right?" Jimmy continued, riding the wave. "Like, here's this global icon, pilot, professor, smuggler, and there he is mid-bananas like the rest of us." The audience was eating it up, but Lucas, watching from the wings, felt the shift, not in the jokes, in Ford's posture. On screen, Ford sat still but alert. One leg crossed over the other, fingers tapping his thigh in an irregular rhythm. Not anxious, focused, like a carpenter waiting for a beam to crack. Jimmy kept going, flipping to the next slide. Another meme. This one showed Ford mid-yawn at a baseball game, the caption reading, "Even legends get bored." Laughter again, louder this time, but in the crowd something flickered. A beat too long between punchline and applause, a subtle delay. Some faces were laughing on cue, others looked sideways, unsure. Ford didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His silence was starting to feel intentional. He glanced toward the screen, then back at Jimmy. His face didn't move, but something about the way his eyelids lowered, just a fraction, sent a ripple through the room. Jimmy leaned forward, trying to keep the flow alive. "Come on, you've got to admit, some of these are pretty good. We even found one where you're holding a wrench in your driveway. That one had 6 million views last month." Ford uncrossed his legs, sat forward, elbows on knees. His voice came slow, measured. "You know what I was fixing?" Jimmy blinked. No." "A water pump," Ford said. "In a neighbor's Jeep. He couldn't afford a shop." The crowd stilled. The laughter halted midstream like someone pulled the plug. "Oh," Jimmy said, scrambling. "Well, that's nice of you." Ford didn't reply. He leaned back again, eyes on the camera crane swinging overhead. Lucas exhaled slowly. He'd seen this look before, once in a private meeting with a studio exec who tried to swap out a script's final act for something more audience-friendly. That guy didn't last through lunch. Jimmy sensed something loosening beneath him, something he couldn't see but was definitely there. He tried again. "Hey, listen, we're all just having some fun here. I mean, the memes, people love you. That's why they make them. It's flattery, right?" Ford said nothing, but this time his smile did reach his eyes, and it wasn't kind. Because Harrison Ford wasn't flattered. He was calculating. And Jimmy Kimmel, for all his ratings and riffs, had no idea he was standing in the shadow of a man deciding the exact second to say something that couldn't be clipped, trimmed, or softened for syndication. Something real. And once it landed, no laugh track on earth would save them. Jimmy glanced toward the side of the set, catching a silent nod from one of the producers. It was the kind of signal that meant they were ready to spice things up, give the audience what they came for. Not truth, not dialogue, moments, memes, noise that trends. He reached under his desk and pulled something from beneath a velvet cloth. The crowd stirred as the object came into view, a leather bullwhip, coiled, familiar, instantly recognizable. The weapon of choice for a cinematic icon. "All right," Jimmy said, voice bright with showman's charm, "before we get all deep and serious, how about one crack for old time's sake?" He held up the whip with both hands, smiling like a kid presenting a birthday cake. "Come on, Harrison, one quick snap for the fans." The audience laughed, clapped, leaned forward in anticipation. Phones rose like a field of blinking stars. Ford didn't move. He stared at the whip for a moment, eyes not curious or amused, just quiet. Then he looked at Jimmy. "That's not a toy," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Every syllable cut like wood grain. "I used that to fight men who stole, who killed, who tried to rewrite history with bullets. It wasn't for laughs." There was no applause. Just a scattered laugh from the back that died mid-breath. Jimmy kept his smile, but it was tighter now. Right, of course, but I mean it's kind of a symbol, right? Indiana Jones, adventure, legacy. Ford's expression didn't change. Legacy, he said slowly, is what you leave behind when you're done speaking, not what they loop for clicks. He pushed the whip gently across the desk with the back of his hand. The leather slithered like a living thing, the motion soft but final. When it touched the edge of the desk, it tipped and fell, landing on the floor with a sound so small, so dry it echoed. The audience didn't know what to do. Some started to clap out of instinct. Others stopped them. A few nervous chuckles flickered and vanished. One man in the third row muttered, "Damn." Jimmy cleared his throat. "Okay, let's shift gears a bit." He shuffled his cue cards, hands moving quicker now. The rhythm was off. The tone had changed. Ford leaned back slowly, like someone settling into the last chair in a burning building. "What gears are we shifting to, Jimmy?" he asked. "Back to me looking grumpy in the supermarket. Back to the clips that tell people I'm funny when I'm not trying to be." Jimmy held up both hands. "No, no, just trying to keep it light." "Light," Ford repeated. He let the word hang in the air like smoke. Lucas was watching from the wings. He saw it happen, the crowd shifting its weight, the band glancing between each other, unsure whether to play or wait. The energy had turned. This wasn't a set anymore. It was a fault line. Jimmy tried one last joke. "I mean, come on, I think you've got more fan edits on TikTok than any actor alive." Ford turned slowly to the audience. "That what I am to you now," he said, "an edit." The silence came heavy, not awkward, not tense, something worse. It was realization. Realization that this man on stage was not here to participate in their ritual. He was here to interrupt it. Jimmy exhaled, reaching for his mug, sipping water like it could wash down the lump in his throat. Ford looked at him, then at the whip still on the floor. "There was a time," he said, "when the whip meant something, when it stood for action. Justice, risk, and now it's a punchline." No one laughed. The audience wasn't just quiet, they were listening. And somewhere deep in that moment, something in the room cracked. Not loudly, not with sparks, but like old wood under pressure. Because this wasn't a talk show anymore. It was a reckoning. And Harrison Ford had just flipped the table without raising his voice. Jimmy fumbled for his cue cards like a man trying to restart a machine that had already decided not to work. His smile had thinned to a line, eyes darting down and back up again, looking for footing on ground that no longer belonged to him. He shuffled the cards with more noise than necessary and spoke with forced brightness. "Let's talk about the new film," he said, his voice just a hair too loud. "You play a rancher fighting a land developer. Sounds intense." Ford didn't answer, he didn't blink. He just sat there, letting the moment stretch past its comfort zone and into something heavier. The air in the studio, once buoyant with laughter and lights, now sat thick like fog that refused to clear. Jimmy tried again. "I mean, you've done cowboys before, right? But this one's different." Still nothing. Ford let the silence work, not as a pause but as a scalpel. And then, only then, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loose, voice low and grainy. "I used to be a carpenter," he said. "That stopped everything. Even the band froze. I built door frames," he went on. "Staircases. One time, a whole deck for a guy who'd just come back from overseas. His house was crooked, foundation slipping. We had to rebuild it from underneath." He glanced up, locking eyes with the nearest camera, as if daring the audience to look away. "You learn real fast in that job," he said. "You learn that one bad angle, one nail driven off mark, can bring the whole thing down. You don't get second takes. You don't get edits. You get what you build." Somewhere in the back, a cough. Then stillness again. Ford looked around the stage now, slow and deliberate, taking in the monitors, the cue cards, the spotlights. The audience lit just enough to see their phones glowing back at him. "And here," he said, "you build out of air. You build laughs out of prompts, out of memes, out of whatever gets a click, but none of it holds weight, it doesn't stand." He sat back again. Jimmy was frozen. A few audience members began clapping. One person, then a couple more. Then it stopped as fast as it started. Not because they disagreed, because they didn't know what side they were on anymore. Ford wasn't performing. He wasn't campaigning. He was telling the truth in a room that wasn't designed to hold it. Jimmy cleared his throat again. Okay, I mean that's fair, but this is entertainment, right? This is a late-night show. It's supposed to be fun. Ford didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You don't pour a concrete foundation just to watch people roller skate on it, he said. You pour it so something can stand there for 100 years. More phones rose now, not for cheering, for recording. Lucas, still backstage, watched it unfold with a kind of grim peace. He wasn't surprised. This was Harrison Ford in his final form, unfiltered, unmoved, unshakable. Jimmy tried a softer angle, his tone laced with something like apology. Hey, we respect you. Everybody here does. We love you. Ford looked at him, really looked at him. No, he said, you love the part of me that sells. You love the adventure, the sarcasm, the hat and the whip. You love what I was in your memory, but what I am now. He opened a hand, gesturing at the air around him. That's not what you booked tonight. The words landed like bricks, stacked one atop the other. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't clapping either. They were quiet, not because they were bored, but because something had shifted inside them. They were watching a man pull the curtain back, not on a machine, but on themselves. Ford stood the stage still, but the room was his now. The cameras weren't filming a guest. They were following a lead. Jimmy wasn't interviewing anymore. He was absorbing damage. I didn't come here to play a clip, Ford said, voice steady. I came here because I believed the story we made was worth something, not to see it wedged between two jokes and a funny hat. And then, for the first time all night, the crowd broke into real applause. Not because they were told, because they felt it. A few shouted his name, others just watched, but there was no more doubt. Harrison Ford had taken the wheel. And Jimmy Kimmel was now just a passenger on his own show. Jimmy sat stiffly behind his desk, his fingers pressed lightly against the cards he was no longer reading. His smile had dissolved into something more neutral, something uncertain. He looked toward the crowd, scanning for refuge, for approval, for some trace of the energy he usually fed on. So, he said, his voice lighter than before, rehearsed but now fragile around the edges, we're all just here to have a good time, right? A wave of claps echoed around the studio, automatic, polite, shallow. The kind of applause that comes not from conviction but from the quiet urge to fill space. Ford didn't move at first. He let the clapping run its course. Let it become hollow. Then he stood. He didn't announce it. Didn't stretch or adjust his jacket or look for his mark. He simply rose, slow and calm, and stepped forward, not toward Jimmy, but toward the edge of the stage. The crowd quieted. The band didn't move. Jimmy shifted in his chair but said nothing. Ford stood there looking out over the audience, letting the lights hit his face, not to spotlight him but to strip everything else away. I've flown through storms, he said. His voice carried across the studio like a sermon spoken in an empty church. Thunder, ice, visibility so low I couldn't see the edge of my own wing, but I didn't turn back, because someone was waiting to land. Someone needed help. A murmur rippled through the seats. Phones rose, but no one made a sound. I didn't carry weapons, he went on. I didn't fly to fight. I flew with one thing, a compass, and a damn sense of duty. Now the silence was heavy, not awkward, reverent. But here, Ford said, turning slowly to take in the cameras, the cue cards, the bright stage lights, that compass doesn't mean much anymore. Not in this room, not in this game. Someone in the back clapped once, then stopped. Ford ignored it. I'm not here for a laugh, he said. I'm not here to dance around a clip reel. I came because I believed there was still a place for something real, for a story about land and loss and standing up when the system says sit down. But you don't want a man. You want a reaction. You want something you can upload before the next guest walks on. He turned his gaze toward Jimmy, who met it quietly, like a student waiting for a test result he already knows he failed. You think this is about promotion? Ford asked. About trending, about nostalgia. He pointed toward the audience now, not in accusation but in recognition. "They don't come here for echoes," he said. "They come here because, deep down, they're tired of the game, the laugh tracks, the setups, the bite-sized sincerity spoon-fed between commercials." The audience was no longer a crowd. It was a room full of individuals, some nodding, some staring, all feeling something shift under their feet. "And you," Ford said, his voice low but steady, "you're too good for this, or at least you were. You had a stage where people listened, where you could have said something that mattered, but instead—" He stopped, took a breath. "Instead, you brought out a whip." A low gasp. Someone laughed too late and too loud, then stopped. Jimmy opened his mouth, closed it again. His hands had gone still. The grin was gone. Ford stepped back from the edge slowly, like he'd just finished carving something out of stone and was making sure it wouldn't fall. "I came tonight to talk about a film," he said, "but I stayed to talk about what we're losing." Lucas, backstage, watched through narrowed eyes. He wasn't surprised. Not anymore. He'd seen Ford take down execs with a single line. He'd seen studio heads rewrite contracts after 15 seconds of silence. But this was different. This was Harrison Ford walking into the very core of modern entertainment, placing a hand on its chest and asking if it still had a heartbeat. The crowd didn't erupt. Not yet. They paused. Then a few stood. Then more. Applause broke, not all at once, but like a dam cracking, leaking emotion until the pressure gave way. Some people clapped slowly. Some shouted. Some just stood with their hands at their sides, stunned. Jimmy sat watching, a host out of position. Not humiliated, not attacked, just left behind. The cameras kept rolling. The director in the booth didn't dare cut. The band stayed frozen, because this was no longer a segment. It was a moment, and moments like this don't come with commercial breaks. Ford looked out once more, taking in the applause, not soaking it in, not basking in it, but acknowledging it. Not everyone was standing. Some weren't sure what they felt. Some weren't ready to be challenged. But Ford didn't come to win them. He came to remind them they weren't born to be audiences. They were born to listen. And sometimes, the loudest thing you can do is refuse to play along. Jimmy shifted in his seat, hands no longer moving, no cards to hold, no words to save him. He looked to the wings, subtle, almost imperceptible, and gave a nod. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't desperate, but it was clear. Security moved. 2 men in black stepped out from behind the curtain, not aggressive, not fast, just present, big enough to part a crowd, calm enough to look like part of the act. The audience noticed. Some stopped clapping, others didn't. Phones turned. Cameras zoomed in. This wasn't in the rundown. But before the men could take more than a few steps, another figure entered the frame. Lucas. He stepped forward from the side of the stage, slow, deliberate, cutting across the path of the guards with the same energy as a man walking into a bar fight with nothing but truth in his pocket. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "He's not being removed," Lucas said. "He's choosing to leave." The words didn't bounce. They landed flat, final. The guards paused. One of them glanced at Jimmy, unsure. The other looked at the floor manager, who just shrugged. Ford hadn't moved yet. He was still standing center stage, eyes not on Jimmy, not on the crowd, but on the space in front of him. The air, the silence, the weight of what had just been said. Then, with a breath so quiet it might have been a thought, he turned. No sigh, no tension in the shoulders, no parting shot, just one step forward. And then another. The kind of walk that didn't need music. The kind of walk that made noise by refusing to fill it. He passed Jimmy without looking at him, not out of disdain, out of clarity. There was simply nothing left to say. At the edge of the stage he paused, turned halfway, looked toward the audience. "Sometimes," Ford said, voice steady, "you leave not because you're defeated, but because you won't be part of something that's already lost." The crowd froze, then someone clapped, then another. And like that, the air cracked open again. They weren't cheering a performance. They were acknowledging a decision. A few people stood, then more. Some shouted his name. Some just nodded like they understood something they couldn't quite explain. Ford didn't smile, he didn't wave, he walked, one pace after another, off stage, past the lights, beyond the script, and Jimmy Kimmel, still seated behind his desk, stared after him. The applause wasn't for Jimmy, it wasn't for the set, or the cameras, or the machine. It was for the man who refused to be part of it. And suddenly, everyone in that room knew the difference between noise and meaning, between attention and respect, and who had earned what. By the time Harrison Ford reached the exit doors of the studio, the internet had already begun to fracture. Clips were everywhere. 10-second cuts, 30-second tributes, edits without music, edits with slow piano. The moment he pushed the whip off the desk, the moment he said, "Sometimes you leave because something's already lost," the hashtag spread fast. #Ford did nothing wrong. People didn't just watch it, they quoted it. They wrote about it. They dragged it into office meetings, classroom debates, late-night arguments with friends who only saw the headline. They replayed the carpenter story, the crooked nail, the failing roof, and used it to talk about more than entertainment. It became a metaphor for broken workplaces, for bad leadership, for culture built on shaky ground. One clip showed Jimmy sitting alone behind his desk, seconds after the credits rolled. His mic was still hot. He didn't know. He leaned forward, stared at his hands, and whispered just loud enough for the front row to catch. "I lost the show the moment I brought out the whip." It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't said to blame. It was said like someone looking at a mirror and realizing they'd mistaken reflection for depth. Comments poured in. That wasn't an interview. That was a master class. He walked out like he built the floor he stepped on. I laughed when he came on. I listened when he left. Some mocked him, of course, there always are. Said he was dramatic, said he overreacted. But those voices didn't hold. Not this time, because this wasn't about a movie. It was about a man who didn't flinch when the machine asked him to play along. And more importantly, it was about a crowd that realized it had been laughing at all the wrong things. Viewers started asking themselves questions they didn't expect. Have I ever ignored someone because they didn't smile for me? Have I ever clapped when I should have listened? Have I ever called something entertaining just because it was easier than calling it honest? Harrison Ford never addressed the backlash. He never tweeted, never gave a follow-up interview. He didn't have to because people already knew. He didn't need the stage. He never did. He had truth. And when truth speaks without begging for attention, it echoes longer than applause ever could. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.